An ordinary walk home on a quiet afternoon, a little girl with a sketchbook, a man with a badge who decided he held all the power. He thought she was an easy target, just another face no one would fight for. He had no idea that a single silent call had just been made to the one person in the world he never should have provoked. This isn't just a story of injustice. It's the story of the reckoning that followed. This story started in one town. But this kind of courage and this kind of injustice can happen anywhere. Let us know what city and state you're watching from, so we know who stands with us in demanding accountability. If you believe these stories need to be told, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to our channel for more. The sun hung low over Pasadena, a fat orange sphere that baked the Sunday afternoon quiet. Heat radiated in shimmering waves from the asphalt, and the only sound was the distant, drowsy hum of a lawnmower several blocks away. For 9-year-old Maya Seagal, the warmth on her skin was a comfortable blanket. She walked with a light bounce in her step, the worn strap of her colorful backpack a familiar weight on her shoulders. Tucked securely under her left arm was her sketchbook, its pages filled with the triumphant charcoal smudges of a productive day. In her right hand, she clutched a shiny red apple, a crisp, sweet reward for finishing the most difficult drawing of her life. A lion, noble and fierce, its mane a chaotic explosion of shading that had earned a rare, impressed nod from her art teacher. She couldn't wait to show it to her dad. He'd pin it on the refrigerator, right next to her drawing of a spaceship, and tell her it was a masterpiece. The pleasant rhythm of her walk, the soft scuff of her sneakers on the cracked concrete, the gentle weight of her creations was broken by a new sound. Not the lawnmower, but something closer, heavier, a low growl of an engine, slowing. Maya glanced over her shoulder and saw it, a black and white Pasadena police cruiser, crawling along the curb at her exact pace. A flicker of something she'd been taught, respect, safety, made her offer a small, shy smile. The car kept pace, a silent, four-wheeled predator. The passenger side window hummed down. "You lost, sweetheart?" The voice that came from the driver's seat was not the friendly, helpful voice from the cartoon she watched. It was flat, cold, and coated in a condescension she could feel even if she didn't know the word for it. Maya stopped walking, her small smile faltering. She stood up a little straighter. "No, sir. I live right there." The officer, Mark Dunning, let his gaze drift from her face down to her sketchbook, then back up. He adjusted the dark sunglasses that hid his eyes. He then added, his voice laced with a strange, lazy curiosity. "You sure you belong around here, sweetheart? This isn't exactly the part of town for art class." The question didn't make sense. This was her street. These were her neighbors' houses, with their neatly trimmed lawns and sleepy-eyed windows. A knot of confusion and a prickle of fear began to form in her stomach. Maya clutched her sketchbook tighter, the cardboard corners digging into her ribs. It was her proof, her passport. Her art was who she was. The friendly smile she had prepared for a police officer was gone now, replaced by a tight, uncertain line. She simply pointed a small, hesitant finger down the street toward the familiar blue door of her house. He didn't look where she was pointing. Instead, he pushed his own door open, the heavy thump echoing in the quiet street. His boots hit the pavement with a hard, authoritative crunch. "ID," he demanded, the word a sharp command, not a question. "I'm 9, she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't have ID." It was a simple fact, as obvious to her as the color of the sky. Dunning's eyes narrowed, a cruel tightening at their corners that his sunglasses couldn't hide. "Right there? Funny. I patrol this block every day. I know the families here. Never seen you before." His tone said she was a liar. It said she was a problem. The space between them vanished. Before Maya could process his movement, his hand shot out. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a vice. His fingers, thick and calloused, wrapped entirely around her small wrist, squeezing with a pressure that made her gasp. The shock of the grab was immediate and absolute. Her own fingers went numb, losing their grip. The sketchbook, her world of lions and spaceships, tumbled to the ground, its pages fluttering open in a silent, scattered protest. The red apple slipped from her other hand, bounced once with a dull thud, and rolled away. A final flash of innocent color before it disappeared into the gutter with a soft splash. "Please," she whimpered, trying to pull away, but his grip was iron. The sudden, aggressive motion had been the premise. The result was pure terror. "Don't get smart," he snapped, his voice a low growl now. He yanked her forward, off balance. With a single, brutally efficient motion, he twisted her small arm behind her back, forcing it up at an angle it was never meant to bend. Maya's mind went white with a searing, electric pain. She felt a horrifying grinding in her shoulder, a prelude to the main event. She tried to scream, but only a choked sob escaped. Then came the sound. It wasn't just a crack. It was a wet, sickening snap that seemed to vibrate up from the sidewalk, through his hand, and into her very soul. It was the sound of something whole becoming irrevocably broken. A raw, piercing scream tore from her throat, a sound of pure agony that shattered the Sunday afternoon silence. The world dissolved into a blur of pain and hot, streaming tears. But even as she collapsed, as the world tilted and the concrete rushed up to meet her, one part of her brain clung to a different instruction, a drill her father had taught her. One long press. "Maya, don't think, just press." Unbeknownst to Dunning, who stood over her breathing heavily, her uninjured hand, trembling uncontrollably in her pocket, had found the smooth, cool metal of her phone. Her thumb found the side button and pressed down, holding it with a desperate or final strength. She felt the slight, haptic buzz against her palm, the silent confirmation. The screen stayed dark, but the connection was made. The raw, piercing scream echoed, bouncing off the stucco walls of the suburban homes and hanging in the humid air like a physical thing. For a moment, Officer Mark Dunning just stood there, his breath hot in his chest, the adrenaline from the snap of the bones starting to curdle into something else. Panic. A window curtain twitched 2 houses down. He couldn't just leave her here. A call to dispatch would create a record, an official log he couldn't erase. Cursing under his breath, he made a decision. He scooped the sobbing child from the pavement with a rough, impatient motion that sent another bolt of agony through her shattered arm. He deposited her unceremoniously into the passenger seat of his cruiser, the scent of old coffee and cheap air freshener filling her senses as the door slammed shut. The drive was short and silent, broken only by the crackle of the police radio and Maya's desperate, stifled sobs as the blurry lights of Pasadena streaked past the window like fallen stars. He didn't pull into the emergency bay. Instead, he stopped at the curb 50 yards from the entrance, killed his lights, and opened her door. "Get out," he ordered, his voice a harsh whisper. He hauled her out onto the sidewalk and simply drove off, the black and white cruiser disappearing into the night without a backward glance, leaving a 9-year-old girl with a broken arm alone under the unforgiving glare of the hospital lights. Inside the emergency room of Pasadena General Hospital, the controlled chaos of a Sunday night was in full swing. Machines beeped a frantic, multi-layered rhythm, and the air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic. A triage nurse saw Maya stumbling through the automatic doors, her small face streaked with tears and dirt, her left arm held at a horrifyingly unnatural angle. Within moments, she was whisked into a curtained cubicle, the world becoming a whirlwind of blue scrubs, gentle but firm hands, and questions she couldn't answer. The pain was a living thing, a white-hot fire that consumed all thought, leaving room for only a single, desperate mantra. "I didn't do anything," she whispered to the nurse checking her pulse, to the orderly cutting away her sleeve, to the ceiling tiles above her. "I didn't do anything." At the main nurse's station, a veteran nurse named Brenda sighed, her pen tapping a rhythmic, impatient beat on a clipboard. The premise was all too familiar. Police drop-off, unaccompanied minor, visible trauma, she announced to the room at large. Probably another runner from the group home over on 5th. Paperwork's going to be a nightmare. A younger nurse, Lucy, looked over from her computer, her brow furrowed with concern. She glanced towards the cubicle where the small, sobbing form was being prepped for X-ray. She's just a little girl. She looks terrified. She keeps saying she didn't do anything. They all say that, honey, Brenda replied without looking up, her voice devoid of malice but heavy with a decade of accumulated cynicism. It's a sad world. Just get her vitals and page social work. They'll handle it when they get around to it. Lucy nodded, but she couldn't shake the image of the child's frightened eyes. A few minutes later, after Maya had returned from X-ray, her arm now temporarily stabilized in a splint. Lucy pushed back the curtain to her cubicle. The sobbing had subsided into quiet, hitched breaths. "Hey there," Lucy said softly. "The doctor will be here in a little bit. Okay? You're safe now." Maya didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the far wall. Lucy noticed her good hand was clenched into a tight fist in her lap, knuckles white. She was clutching a cell phone. The screen was dark, but a single green bar at the top indicated an active call. The timer next to it reading 3417, and beneath the timer, a name, Claire Seagal. 34 minutes ago and miles away, Claire Seagal had been listening to the engine of her Challenger purr, enjoying a rare moment of peace, when her phone had chirped with the unique, urgent tone she had assigned to one person, her niece. She'd answered immediately, and her world had tilted on its axis. She heard it all. Maya's polite, fearful voice, the cold, condescending questions of a man, the sudden gasp, the thud of something falling, the sickening, unforgettable snap of bone, and the scream that was now seared into her memory. She didn't speak, didn't announce her presence. She just listened, her knuckles turning white on the steering wheel as she flew down the freeway. Her military training kicked in, suppressing the inferno of rage with a layer of ice-cold focus. Analyze the data, locate the target, neutralize the threat. The target was the hospital. The threat was everything that stood between her and Maya. She strode into the ER not like a visitor, but like an operator, her eyes scanning the chaos with an unnerving calm that made people instinctively step aside. Maya Seagal, 9 years old, broken arm, room number, she said to the nurse at the front desk, her voice leaving no room for argument. The nurse pointed. Cubicle 6. Claire was there in seconds. She pushed aside the curtain, and what she saw made her chest tighten into a single, painful knot. Maya lay on the gurney, looking impossibly small and fragile against the sterile white sheets, her arm encased in a temporary brace. The moment their eyes met, Maya's fragile composure shattered, and she began to cry again, deep, shuddering sobs of relief and pain. Claire dropped to her knees beside the bed, her movements fluid and gentle. She didn't touch the broken arm. Instead, she carefully took Maya's uninjured hand. "I'm here, baby girl," she whispered, her voice a low, steady anchor. "I got you. I'm right here." Maya clung to her hand, her small body trembling. "He just grabbed me," she whispered, the words tumbling out between sobs. "I told him my name. I told him who my dad was." Claire froze, a sudden stillness in her features. "You told him? You told him who your dad is?" Maya nodded, fresh tears welling. "I told him I was Michael Seagal's daughter." She took a shaky breath, her voice cracking with a child's utter confusion at the cruelty of the world. He laughed. The air in the cubicle grew cold. Claire's blood seemed to turn to ice in her veins. This wasn't a random act of police brutality. It wasn't a mistake born of fear or misunderstanding. It was calculated. It was deliberate. The laugh echoed in the space between them, a ghost sound that confirmed her worst fear. This was targeted. The ice in Claire's veins did not melt. It sharpened. The single, chilling word targeted solidified from a horrifying realization into a concrete mission objective. The rage was still there, a white-hot reactor core deep inside her, but her training had built a containment wall of pure, cold logic around it. Emotion was a liability. Information was ammunition. After giving Maya's hand one last, reassuring squeeze and seeing the exhaustion finally pull the little girl toward a restless sleep, Claire stood up. Her movements were fluid, economical, devoid of any wasted energy. She walked out of the cubicle, her focus so absolute that the surrounding chaos of the ER seemed to bend away from her. She approached the nurse's station, her eyes finding Lucy, the younger nurse who had shown a spark of compassion. There was no pleading in her voice, only quiet, unshakable command. "I need to see the EMT intake log for my niece, Maya Seagal, the one from the police drop-off." Lucy, startled by the intensity in Claire's gaze, fumbled for a moment before nodding and retrieving a thin sheet of paper from a stack of clipboards. She handed it over, her hand trembling slightly. Claire took the document, her eyes scanning past the medical jargon, vitals, preliminary diagnosis, patient status. She was looking for one thing. Her finger traced down a column of logistical data until it found the box labeled transport unit. The handwriting was a hasty scrawl, but the information was clear. Pasadena PD, Patrol Unit 73D. That was the premise? The first key. Claire found a deserted corner in a dimly lit waiting area, the air stale with the scent of old magazines and anxiety. She pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over a single name in her contacts before pressing down. The phone rang twice before a familiar, professional voice answered. "Sarah, it's Claire. I need a name. An officer in Pasadena, Patrol Unit 73D. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a pocket of silence so profound Claire could hear the faint hum of the hospital's ventilation system. "Claire, it's been a while. Is this official, or is this you?" "It's personal," Claire said, her voice a flat, emotionless line. "He broke a little girl's arm. My niece." Another pause followed, this one shorter, heavier, freighted with the weight of a resignation that Claire knew all too well. It was the sound of a good cop who had seen the system protect the bad ones too many times. "The things that never change," Sarasota murmured, more to herself than to Claire. "Give me 10 minutes. And Claire, be smart about this. You know how they circle the wagons when one of their own gets into the wind?" The line went dead. Claire didn't move. She stared at the blank screen, the warning echoing in her mind. Circle the wagons. It wasn't a warning. It was a confirmation of the battlefield. Exactly 10 minutes later, her phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was a block of information, concise and devastating. "Officer Mark Dunning. Badge Gerber 5372, not on duty. Vehicle unauthorized. Frequents Benny's Grill. Pasadena. Sundays approx. 1900 urge. Same booth." Claire read the message once, then a second time, committing it to memory. This was the result of her call, the key turning in the lock. Her face remained a mask of calm control, but behind her eyes, a plan was crystallizing, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. Benny's Grill was an island of greasy, fluorescent normalcy. The air smelled of fried onions and stale coffee. Families shared baskets of fries, and the low murmur of conversation was punctuated by the clatter of cutlery. In a worn, red vinyl booth in the back corner sat Mark Dunning. He was out of uniform, dressed in a faded polo shirt, laughing at something on his phone. He looked utterly relaxed, a man without a care in the world, a predator resting after a successful hunt. The bell above the diner door chimed softly. All eyes turned for a moment as Claire Seagal stepped inside. She didn't pause to let her eyes adjust. She had already identified her target. She moved through the diner with a silent, deliberate grace that was entirely out of place, her path a straight, unwavering line to his booth. He didn't look up until her shadow fell across his table. "Can I help you?" he grumbled, annoyed at the interruption. Claire didn't speak. She pulled out her phone. Her thumb tapped the screen once, and she placed it face up on the sticky tabletop between the salt shaker and the ketchup bottle. The premise was her evidence. The action was the play button. Maya's tiny, terrified voice filled the diner. "Please stop. That hurts. I didn't do anything." Then came the sound, the sickening, unmistakable snap of bone. The result was absolute. The diner went utterly silent. A fork clattered onto a plate. The waitress froze mid-stride, a coffee pot held aloft. Dunning's smirk vanished, his face slackening with shock and dawning horror. The color drained from his cheeks. "Where did you get that?" he stammered, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. "You know who that little girl is?" Claire asked, her voice a low, chilling whisper that cut through the silence more effectively than a shout. "Doesn't matter," he blustered, trying to regain some semblance of authority. She resisted. "Her name is Maya Seagal," Claire interrupted, letting the name hang in the air. She watched his face for the flicker of recognition, but there was none. She delivered the final blow. "She's Michael Seagal's daughter." His face went from pale to ghostly white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "And I'm Claire Seagal," she finished. She slid a napkin toward him, a silent, damning indictment. He stared at her, his bravado completely shattered. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping even lower, meant only for him. "You broke the wrong little girl," she warned, her words precise and deadly. "And now, I'm going to break your career." She turned without another word and walked away. The bell on the door chimed once more as she stepped out into the night, leaving him frozen in a tableau of his own making, in a diner that was as silent as a tomb. Claire slid back into the driver's seat of her car, the engine rumbling to life with a low growl that mirrored the feeling in her chest. The confrontation was phase one, a personal delivery of accountability. Now it was time for phase two. She didn't drive away. Instead, she navigated her phone with deft, economical movements. She opened a secure, end-to-end encrypted messaging app and selected a contact saved only as the loudspeaker. She attached the audio file of Maya's assault, the file that had silenced a diner and shattered a man's composure. Her message was brief, a cold, clear command. Make it rain. No splashback. She watched the 2 check marks confirm delivery, then locked the screen, put the car in gear, and pulled away from the curb, melting into the anonymous river of headlights on the boulevard. The package was delivered. The storm was now in someone else's hands, and it didn't begin with a thunderclap, but with a whisper. Sometime after midnight, the audio file appeared on a niche whistleblower platform known as The Beacon. There was no commentary, no context, just a raw, unedited WAV file titled Pasadena PD 73D Incident. For an hour, it sat dormant. Then, a late-night journalist on the East Coast, scrolling through feeds for a lead, found it. He listened once, his blood running cold. He listened a second time to confirm what he'd heard. His post on social media was cautious but urgent. Unconfirmed audio purportedly involving a Pasadena police officer. The content is deeply disturbing. Listen for yourself. That was the spark. The link was shared a dozen times, then 100. It spread not like a ripple, but like a flash fire across dry grass. Activist groups, legal watchdogs, and horrified citizens amplified it. Hashtags began to trend organically. Shin under Pasadena PD, listen to this, and for the anonymous child whose voice broke hearts across the country. Justice for Jane Doe. By sunrise, the file had been downloaded and re-uploaded hundreds of thousands of times. It was no longer a file. It was a phenomenon, a piece of raw, undeniable truth that had broken free of its source. The mainstream news outlets, initially hesitant, could no longer ignore the roar. By 7 a.m., cable news networks were airing sanitized snippets. The sickening snap of bone bleeped out, but the child's terrified pleading left untouched. Commentators debated protocol and legality, But the emotional core of the recording was irrefutable. The premise of public outrage demanded a larger story. The question on everyone's lips was, who was the little girl? A local Pasadena reporter, chasing the story on the ground, made the connection first. A 9-year-old girl with a broken arm admitted to Pasadena General the previous evening, a cross-reference with public records for known high-profile residents, an anonymous tip from a hospital staffer who felt a moral obligation. The resulting headline poured rocket fuel on the fire. Michael Seagal's daughter assaulted by police. Leaked audio reveals. The story exploded. It was on every screen, every news feed, in every corner of the nation. This wasn't an abstract tragedy anymore. It was personal, attached to a name everyone recognized. The victim had a face, a family, a famous father whose on-screen persona was built on justice and retribution. The nation was captivated. Officer Mark Dunning woke up not to his alarm clock, but to the incessant, angry buzzing of his phone. He fumbled for it, his screen a blizzard of notifications and tagged posts. He saw his own face staring back at him from a news site. He heard Maya's screams coming from his own television. The public condemnation was a tidal wave, and his first and only instinct was to run. With frantic, trembling fingers, he deactivated his Facebook, his Instagram, his Twitter. He called the station, his voice cracking as he reported sick, citing a sudden fever. But it was too late. Peeking through the blinds of his living room window, he saw the result of his actions. 2 news vans were already parked across the street, their satellite dishes aimed at his front door like cannons. Inside the Pasadena Police Department, the atmosphere was thick with a toxic mixture of fear and resentment. The usual morning camaraderie had evaporated, replaced by fractured silence and hushed, anxious conversations in the locker rooms. No one defended Mark Dunning, not openly. His temper was known, his heavy-handed tactics an open secret. But the audio had made him radioactive, and no one wanted to be caught in the blast zone. Officers who had shared a beer with him last week now avoided eye contact, distancing themselves from the man at the center of the national firestorm. But far from the noise in the quiet, sterile peace of a hospital room, a different kind of response was taking place. While Maya slept, her breathing deep and even from the pain medication, a small group of nurses gathered by her bed. Led by Lucy, they took a permanent marker and, one by one, began to sign the clean, white plaster of her cast. There were no grand statements, just small, powerful words of human kindness, a quiet counterpoint to the ugliness of the world outside. You're brave. You matter. And on the space just above her small, healing fingers, a final, simple promise: justice is coming. While the world outside erupted in a storm of digital outrage and broadcast headlines, Claire Seagal operated in the quiet eye of her own hurricane. She had watched the audio file she released go viral from the sterile calm of the hospital waiting room, not with satisfaction, but with the detached focus of a general watching an artillery strike soften a target. The public outcry was a necessary tool, but it was imprecise. Now, it was time for a targeted strike. A second encrypted file had arrived from Sarasota, this one containing scanned documents, the complete, unredacted records of 3 prior excessive force complaints filed against Mark Dunning. 3 different stories of pain and intimidation, each ending with the same bureaucratic stamp. Dismissed, no action taken. Claire printed everything, the new files, a transcript of the emergency call, the EMT drop-off records. She slid the crisp sheets into a slim, professional folder. The hoodie she had worn in her frantic rush to the hospital was gone, replaced by a charcoal blazer and dark jeans. She was no longer just a furious aunt. She was an adversary preparing for a formal engagement. The Pasadena Police Department headquarters was a fortress of smoked glass and concrete, designed to project unassailable authority. The lobby buzzed with a tense, frantic energy. Phones rang unanswered, and officers hurried through the atrium, their faces grim, refusing to make eye contact with the reporters already camped out near the entrance. Claire walked past them all, her heels clicking with sharp, rhythmic purpose on the polished granite floor. The officer at the front desk, a man with a thick neck and wary eyes, looked up as she approached. "I'm here to see Captain Riley," she said. The officer's expression soured. "Captain's in a meeting. You'll have to make an appointment." It was a textbook dismissal. A bureaucratic wall. Claire didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply placed the folder she had prepared on the high counter, sliding it forward until it stopped just short of his hand. "My name is Claire Seagal," she said, her voice even and cold. "My niece is Maya Seagal. This folder contains a copy of the evidence we'll be providing to every national news outlet in exactly 1 hour if the captain's meeting doesn't end." The officer's eyes flickered from her face down to the folder and back again. The premise was clear. The result was immediate. He swallowed, picked up his phone, and mumbled into the receiver. "Sir, Miss Seagal is here to see you." "Yes, sir. I'll send her up." Captain Riley's office was on the top floor, a corner suite with a panoramic view of the city he was sworn to protect. It was a room insulated by power, all polished mahogany, framed commendations, in supple leather. Riley himself was a weathered man with silver stubble, and he stood as Claire entered, gesturing to a chair with a practiced, disarming smile. It was a smile designed to de-escalate, to manage, to control. Claire remained standing. "Ms. Seagal, thank you for coming in," Riley began, his tone paternalistic. "I want to assure you we are taking this matter very seriously. It's a regrettable situation." He paused, steepling his fingers. "Look, I understand you're emotional, but Officer Dunning is a veteran with a robust record of enforcement in a tough district. He gets results." Claire let out a short, humorless breath that was sharper than a laugh. "Robust?" she repeated, her voice dripping with ice. "Your files call it 3 prior excessive force complaints, all of them dismissed for lack of evidence." She slid the folder across his gleaming desk. The crisp sound of paper on wood was the only noise in the room. "Read them, Captain. This isn't a situation. It's a pattern. A man with a badge who targets people he thinks won't fight back." Riley's jaw tightened. His eyes scanned the top page, a flicker of deep annoyance crossing his features before being suppressed. "Those were complex situations, lacking independent verification," he said, pushing the folder back an inch. "You have to understand the pressure these officers are under. They make split-second decisions. Sometimes, those decisions are messy. This wasn't messy, Captain." Claire's voice was dangerously quiet. It was deliberate. He saw a child he didn't think mattered. This was the moment the captain's manufactured calm finally cracked. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest, his tone becoming cold and official. He was no longer a concerned community leader. He was a bureaucrat defending his fortress. "That's a very serious and, frankly, inflammatory allegation. We are an impartial department. We don't see color, we see conduct. And right now, what I see is you making threats based on a recorded phone call that has yet to be authenticated." Claire met his gaze without flinching. The negotiation was over. This was the final deflection, the system's last line of defense. Now came the ultimatum. "You have until 10 tomorrow morning," she stated, her words clear and precise, each one a hammer blow. "You will hold a press conference, and you will announce that Officer Mark Dunning has been fired for cause. Not suspended, not put on leave. Fired. Publicly. Or the Seagal family will go live with everything. The audio, the EMT records, these prior complaints, and a team of civil rights attorneys who would love to see what's under the rocks in your department." As Claire walked out of the station, the low murmur from the street was growing louder. The premise of the viral audio had produced its inevitable result. Protesters had begun to gather. At first, it was just a handful, a few angry parents with handmade signs, but their numbers were swelling by the minute. A crowd of college students, local activists, and concerned citizens coalescing on the steps. Their chant started as a disorganized rumble and grew into a unified roar that echoed off the concrete walls. Justice for Maya! Protect kids! Not egos! The crowd parted like the sea when a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The press surged forward, a frantic mob of cameras and microphones. The back door opened, and Michael Seagal stepped out. He wore a simple dark suit, no tie. His face was a mask of iron control, unreadable, but his eyes, fixed on the steps of the precinct, were like a hawk's zeroing in on its prey. He didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge the reporter shouting his name. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, climbing the steps as if ascending to a gallows. He reached the top, took the microphone offered to him, and the entire street fell silent. The only sound was the snapping of a flag in the wind. "A man put his hands on my 9-year-old daughter," he began, his voice steady but carrying a weight that seemed to press down on the crowd. It was the voice of a man whose patience with the world had been exhausted. He twisted her arm. He threw her to the ground. He broke her, like she didn't matter. He paused, letting the brutal simplicity of the words sink in. He didn't care who she was, and that's the part. That's what hurts the most. He looked up, past the crowd, his gaze seemingly penetrating the walls of the building behind him. Not because she's my daughter, but because he looked at a little girl and saw nothing worth protecting. His eyes then found the lens of the nearest news camera, a direct, chilling address to an audience of millions, and to the men inside the building. "To Officer Mark Dunning, you picked the wrong little girl," he then widened his gaze, "and to the system that created him, that protected him, that allowed him to feel so powerful, you have one shot to fix this. Before we fix it for you." Michael Seagal's final words hung in the air long after the press conference ended, an ultimatum that sent shockwaves through the city's political structure. The pressure was immense, immediate, and inescapable. The following morning, as promised, Captain Riley stood before a podium, his face grim, and announced that Officer Mark Dunning's employment with the Pasadena Police Department had been terminated, effective immediately. On the surface, it was a victory. But that evening, as Claire and Michael watched the news report from a quiet room in the hospital, the wind felt hollow. "They gave us his head on a platter," Michael said, his voice flat as he stared at the television. "They think that makes it over." Claire looked away from the screen, her gaze distant, fixed on the city lights beyond the window. "They cut off a diseased limb, hoping we won't notice the rot in the rest of the body," she replied, her voice low and intense. "It's not enough. Reacting to this isn't enough. We can't just play defense every time this happens to someone. We need to go on offense. We need to build something, a machine of our own." Michael turned to her, a new light dawning in his eyes. He was a man accustomed to building things, film sets, production companies, empires of fiction. But this was different. This was real. "A machine," he repeated, testing the word. "What kind of machine?" "One that doesn't wait for a 911 call," Claire said, the plan that had been forming in the back of her mind now coming into sharp focus. "One with its own investigators, retired detectives who know the system's dirty tricks. One with its own lawyers, civil rights attorneys who live for this kind of fight. One with its own platform to expose the truth, to give a voice to the people they try to silence. We don't just counterpunch. We build a fortress and an armory." The premise was laid bare. The system's token sacrifice was an insult to their intelligence. The action that followed was swift and decisive. Over the next 72 hours, the Seagal family's immense resources were mobilized not for a lawsuit, but for a war. Michael's conference rooms, usually reserved for script readings and budget meetings, were filled with a hand-picked team of the best legal minds in the state. Claire spent hours on encrypted calls, leveraging a network of contacts she hadn't spoken to since leaving the military. She recruited a veteran homicide detective who had retired in disgust after seeing too many cases buried, and a forensic accountant who could track money and power through the labyrinth of city contracts and police union funds. They worked relentlessly, drafting a charter, securing nonprofit status, and designing a secure, encrypted website. They chose a name that was both an acronym and a statement of intent. EFISET, the FIST Initiative. Fighters for Institutional Safety and Truth. Its mission statement, which went live on a sleek, dark-themed website, was unambiguous: to investigate, expose, and legally dismantle patterns of systemic abuse within law enforcement. We do not wait for permission, we shine the light. The launch was announced via a single, coordinated press release. The result was instantaneous and overwhelming. The initiative gained immediate public backing. Within the first hour, the website's servers were struggling to handle the traffic. Donations poured in, from seven-figure checks wired by sympathetic celebrities to $5 contributions from thousands of ordinary people who saw their own frustrations reflected in the initiative's mission. The media covered it extensively, framing it as the next chapter in a high-stakes drama. But the most significant response came through the site's confidential submission portal. It was a deluge. Hundreds, then thousands of stories flooded the server, tales of wrongful arrests, trumped-up charges, and casual brutality that had been silenced for years, submitted by people who had finally been given a place to speak. The system, however, never stays silent for long. The backlash, when it came, was not a press release or a legal filing. It was quiet, personal, and brutally efficient. On a cool Thursday morning, just after 6 a.m., Claire was on her morning run. The familiar rhythm of her breathing and the slap of her sneakers on the pavement, a brief, welcome respite. The street was quiet, bathed in the soft, gray light of dawn. This was the premise, a moment of normalcy, of vulnerability. The action was a gray sedan with tinted windows screeching to a stop just ahead of her, blocking her path. Three men in plain clothes jumped out. They were broad-shouldered, bull-necked, and moved with a clumsy aggression that was nothing like the trained precision of law enforcement. One of them flashed a badge so quickly it was impossible to read. "Claire Seagal?" he grunted. "You're under temporary detainment for obstruction and aggravated assault on a peace officer." Before she could process the words or formulate a response, they moved. There was no request to put your hands behind your back. One man grabbed her right arm, another her left, their grips bruisingly tight. The third produced a pair of zip-tie cuffs and cinched them around her wrists, the plastic biting sharply into her skin. There were no Miranda rights. There was no explanation. It was a clean, thuggish extraction designed for maximum intimidation. They shoved her into the back of the sedan, the door slamming shut with a heavy, final thud. Through the window, she saw the faces of her neighbors peering out, their morning routines interrupted, their cell phones already raised and recording. The holding cell at a substation she didn't recognize was cold and smelled faintly of bleach and despair. There was no official paperwork, no booking process. It was an unofficial limbo, a clear violation of every protocol. This was retaliation, stripped of all legal pretense. An hour passed in silence. Then, a man in an expensive suit, not a cop, but a lawyer or a city official, appeared on the other side of the glass. He didn't speak. He simply slid a clipboard with a single sheet of paper through the slot in the door. Claire picked it up. It wasn't a confession form. It was a neatly typed statement, a voluntary agreement. It stipulated that all charges against her would be dropped immediately, provided she signed the document, which demanded she cease any and all involvement, public and private, with the FIST Initiative and all related investigations into police misconduct. It was a gag order disguised as a deal. It was a demand for her surrender. She read it once, her expression unreadable. She looked up, meeting the cold, expectant gaze of the man in the suit. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that was more powerful than any outburst, she raised the paper and, holding his stare, tore it cleanly in half. She let the two pieces flutter to the concrete floor, a silent, defiant answer. The two halves of the torn document were still settling on the floor of the cell, when the footage hit the internet. It was shaky, filmed from a neighbor's window, but its contents were brutally clear. Claire Seagal, mid-run, being swarmed and cuffed by unidentified men and forced into an unmarked sedan. Within 10 minutes, the clip, uploaded with the hashtag Courtney Where's Claire Seagal, was spreading with explosive force. Michael Seagal saw it not on a news report, but in a text from his head of security. He watched the 30-second video once. The controlled rage he had maintained for days solidified into something else entirely, a terrifying, glacial calm. They hadn't just retaliated against his initiative, they had put their hands on his family. Again. He didn't call the Pasadena PD. Calling the kidnappers for help was a fool's errand. He made a different call, one to a private number high within the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. His voice was devoid of emotion, each word a piece of sharpened steel. They took my sister, Pasadena. Unmarked car. No booking. I have the video. You have 1 hour to produce a federal agent at my location before I personally tear that city apart to find her. Less than an hour later, the steel door of Claire's holding cell clanged open. It wasn't a local officer who stood there, but a man in a crisp, dark suit, his face impassive, his bearing radiating federal authority. Behind him stood Michael, his presence a thundercloud filling the narrow hallway. Flanking them were two sharp-eyed lawyers. The agent stepped forward, his gaze taking in the torn paper on the floor and the raw, red marks on Claire's wrists. "Ms. Seagal," the agent said, his voice calm and professional. "I'm Agent Miller, Department of Civil Rights. You're with us." One of the lawyers stepped forward with a pair of cutters and snapped the plastic zip tie, freeing Claire's hands. She stood up slowly, rubbing her wrists, her eyes locking with her brother's. No words were needed. The message was clear. The rules of engagement had changed. They had tried to silence her with a back-alley tactic. And in response, Michael had called down the full weight of the federal government. They walked out of the substation, leaving the local officers speechless and pale-faced in their wake. The system had overplayed its hand, and now it was facing a countermove it had never anticipated. That evening, the strategy session wasn't about defense. It was about amplifying their offense. In a secure hotel suite that had been converted into a temporary war room, their legal team buzzed with activity. "The illegal detention gives us immense leverage," one lawyer said. "We can file a federal suit that will bury the department." But Claire shook her head. The premise of the system's attack demanded a response that went beyond the courts. "A lawsuit is our voice," she said, her own voice steady. "This isn't about us anymore. The system tried to silence one person. We need to respond with the voices of hundreds." Michael nodded in agreement. "We give them a stage. We turn on the lights and hand them the microphone." The town hall was organized with military precision. They booked a large high school gymnasium in a central Pasadena neighborhood, a neutral ground that belonged to the community. They sent out a simple, open invitation through the FIST Initiative's growing social media channels. "If you have a story, we are here to listen." The result was a quiet flood. That evening, the bleachers were packed with over 600 people. They were a cross-section of the city: parents, teachers, mechanics, students, and retirees. They sat in a heavy, expectant silence, a shared unspoken pain hanging in the air. Claire and Michael stood on the gymnasium floor, but they didn't take a podium. They stood with the crowd. "This isn't our stage," Michael said into a simple, handheld microphone, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "It's yours. We're just here to make sure the lights stay on." At first, no one moved. Then, a young Latina woman stood up, her hands trembling. She spoke of being pulled over for a broken taillight that wasn't broken, and the humiliation of having two officers empty her purse onto the hood of her car in full view of her neighbors. After she spoke, a retired, gray-haired police officer took the mic, his voice thick with shame. He didn't share a story of abuse, but of complicity, Speaking of the blue wall of silence that forced him into early retirement when he tried to report his partner for consistently targeting black teenagers. Each story built upon the last, creating a devastating mosaic of fear and injustice. Then, a middle-aged man in a mechanic's work shirt, his hands stained with grease, stepped forward. He walked to the microphone as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. "My name is James Henderson," he began, his voice cracking. "Last month, my son, David, he's 15, on the honor roll, was walking home from the library. An officer stopped him, said he fit the description of a robbery suspect." Henderson's eyes glistened with tears. "He threw his library books on the ground, pushed him against the car, all because he was wearing a hoodie in his own neighborhood. There was no robbery. They never found one. They let my boy go an hour later. No apology." He took a ragged breath, his gaze sweeping across the hundreds of silent, nodding faces. They made him feel like a criminal for existing. This isn't about one bad cop. It's about a feeling they give us, a tax we have to pay for walking on our own streets." The gymnasium erupted, not in anger, but in a profound, sustained applause of shared experience. The emotional dam had broken. In the back of the gym, a team from the Fist Initiative was quietly launching the website they had built, seagaljustice.org. They announced the URL at the end of the town hall, a digital repository for the stories that had been shared, and for the thousands more that had remained unspoken. The premise of hundreds of voices speaking as one created an immediate and seismic result. By the next morning, the website had received over 18,000 verified submissions, each one a crack in the foundation of the department's authority. The pressure was no longer just from a famous family. It was a grassroots insurrection. The political calculus became simple and brutal. By noon, the mayor's office announced a press conference. Pasadena's chief of police, Grayson Hale, his face a mask of strained resignation, announced he was stepping down, effective immediately. 20 minutes later, the district attorney's office, facing an avalanche of potential lawsuits and a federal civil rights investigation, issued its own statement, announcing the formal reopening of 10 previously closed cases involving former officer Mark Dunning. The resignation of Chief Hale and the reopening of Dunning's old cases were not an end, but the firing shot of a new battle. The weeks leading up to the trial were a grueling war of legal attrition. Dunning's defense team, funded by a national police union, filed a blizzard of motions attempting to have the emergency call recording dismissed as inadmissible, to have the trial moved to a different county, to seal the records of Dunning's prior complaints. One by one, a stern, no-nonsense judge denied them all. The stage was being set. Jury selection became a meticulous, 2-week chess match, with the prosecution seeking jurors capable of empathy and the defense searching for faces hardened by a cynical, unwavering faith in authority. As the trial date neared, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch, turning the Harris County District Court into the epicenter of a national conversation on justice, race, and power. The courtroom was a pressure cooker. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of old wood polish and collective anticipation. On one side of the aisle sat the Seagal family. Claire was a study in stillness, her expression unreadable, a slim notebook resting untouched in her lap. Beside her, Michael sat motionless, his large hands clasped in front of him, exuding the focused calm of a blade before a strike. Next to them, dressed in a soft blue dress, was Maya, her healing arm in a removable brace, her eyes sharp and alert, taking in everything. Across the aisle, Mark Dunning looked like a man hollowed out. He was thinner, paler, the swaggering arrogance he once wore like a second skin, now replaced by a haunted look. He stared fixedly at the defense table, refusing to meet the gaze of the family he had torn apart. "The state of Texas versus Raymond Dunning," the bailiff announced, his voice booming. The jury was seated, their faces a mixture of solemnity and nervous curiosity. The prosecutor, a sharp, Turn-on to composed woman named Alana Ramirez rose to give her opening statement. "This is not a case about a difficult arrest," she began, her voice clear and resonant. "It is not about a misunderstanding or a split-second decision gone wrong. This is a case about a man with a badge and a gun who saw a 9-year-old child walking home from art class and decided he held absolute power over her. Power over her freedom of movement, power over her dignity, and ultimately, power over her small, fragile bones." She paused, letting the silence hang. "Over the course of this trial, we will prove that Officer Mark Dunning knowingly, violently, and without any lawful cause assaulted a minor, and that after committing this act of brutality, he abandoned her at a hospital, believing his uniform would make him untouchable. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we begin the work of proving him wrong." The defense attorney, a slick, expensive-looking man named Marcus Thorne, offered a starkly different narrative. "This is a case about a tragic misunderstanding," he argued, his tone smooth and reasonable. "Twisted by a partial, illegally obtained recording and amplified by the immense pressure of a famous family seeking not justice, but vengeance. The evidence will show that my client, Officer Mark Dunning, a dedicated public servant, was faced with a non-compliant individual in a high-stress situation. He made a judgment call. It was not a perfect call, but it was a human one." The arguments hung in the air, two competing realities. Then, the prosecution began to build its case, brick by damning brick. First came the photos, large, high-resolution images of Maya's wrists, circled with the angry purple and yellow of deep bruises. Then came the x-rays, displayed on a large monitor for the jury to see. The clean, sharp fracture in her ulna, a stark white line against the gray of the bone. Then, Ramirez addressed the court. "Your Honor, the state's next piece of evidence is the emergency call recording from the victim's phone." A technician wheeled a speaker to the front of the courtroom. A profound silence fell. "Members of the jury," the judge said, his voice grave, "you are instructed to listen carefully." The audio began. First, Maya's tiny, terrified voice, pleading, "Please stop. That hurts. I didn't do anything." The jurors leaned forward, their expressions tight with concentration. Then came the sound that had already haunted a nation. The sickening, wet snap of her arm breaking echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. It was no longer a sound filtered through a TV speaker. It was real, present, and horrifying. A woman on the jury gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Another juror squeezed her eyes shut. The court reporter's fingers froze above her keys. Mark Dunning flinched in his chair as if he'd been physically struck. His own act of violence played back for him to endure. The audio ended, but the sound lingered in the oppressive silence that followed. The next day, the prosecution called a retired Pasadena police lieutenant to the stand, a man with a weary face and a lifetime of secrets in his eyes. He testified that complaints against Dunning were an open secret. "We called his methods Dunning's tune-ups," the lieutenant confessed, his voice low. "Everyone knew. You don't get 3 serious complaints like that dismissed unless command wants them dismissed. It was easier to bury it, to protect the department from scandal, than to deal with the man himself." Then Claire Seagal took the stand. Her testimony on direct examination was measured, factual, and delivered with military precision. She recounted the call, her arrival at the hospital, her conversation with Maya, but it was the cross-examination by Marcus Thorne that electrified the room. "Ms. Seagal," Thorne began, circling her like a shark, "you have an extensive background in military special operations, do you not? And you are, I believe, a regional boxing champion?" "That's correct," Claire replied, her voice even. "So you are, in fact, a highly trained weapon. Would you agree?" "I'm a highly trained soldier," Thorne smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "A soldier who," he continued, turning to the jury, "upon hearing a partial, out-of-context phone call, tracked down my client and, By your own admission, physically confronted him. You slammed him against his own car. Is that the action of a concerned aunt, Miss Seagal, or is it the action of a vigilante looking for a fight? It was the action of someone holding a man accountable when his own department wouldn't, Claire said calmly, her gaze unwavering. Thorne's smile widened. He had what he wanted. He turned back to the judge. So you took the law into your own hands. No further questions, Your Honor. He walked back to his table, radiating a smug satisfaction, leaving the insinuation hanging in the air. And then, on the final day of testimony, it was Maya's turn. She was led gently to the witness stand by a victim's advocate, her small form almost swallowed by the imposing oak chair. The courtroom, which had buzzed with whispers and coughs, fell into a profound, reverent silence. The prosecutor approached her softly. Maya, can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what happened that afternoon? Maya looked at the jury, her gaze clear and steady. When she spoke, her voice was small but carried like a bell in the still room. I was walking home, she began. He stopped me. He asked me for ID, but I'm 9. She paused, taking a small breath. I told him my name. I told him my dad's name. He laughed. Her voice trembled for the first time. Then he grabbed me, and he twisted my arm. I heard it break. She finished speaking, and the silence in the room was absolute. It was a silence filled with the weight of a child's simple, unadorned truth. Then, Maya reached down beside her and lifted a piece of paper. It was her own drawing. It was a crayon sketch, simple and heartfelt, of a little girl with her arm in a big cast, standing tall in front of a crowd of people. Below it, written in the neat, careful letters of a 10-year-old, were 3 words, I'm stronger now. There was no cue, no order from the judge. It started with a single woman in the back row standing up, then another, then a man in a suit, then a dozen more, a silent, powerful wave of movement rippling through the gallery. In a matter of seconds, every single person in the public seating was on their feet, a quiet, powerful standing ovation of respect and belief for the small girl who had refused to be silenced. The silent ovation hung in the air for a long moment before the sharp crack of the judge's gavel broke the spell. Order, he commanded, his voice firm, pulling the courtroom back from the precipice of pure emotion into the rigid structure of legal procedure. He gave his final, monotonous instructions to the jury, his words a drone of legal statutes that felt worlds away from the raw truth they had just witnessed. Then, the 12 jurors filed out, their faces impassive masks that betrayed nothing. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, and a new kind of silence descended upon the room, thicker, heavier, and fraught with the unbearable tension of the weight. Hours crawled by, each tick of the clock on the wall a separate and distinct torture. The Seagulls sat as a single silent unit, waiting for a verdict that felt like it would decide more than just one man's fate. 6 hours and 11 minutes after they had disappeared, the jury room door opened again. The bailiff's voice boomed, All rise! The jury filed back in, their faces still unreadable but etched with exhaustion. They took their seats. Mark Dunning, who had been a gray, slumped figure for hours, sat bolt upright, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table before him. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes that now looked hard as steel, stood and handed a slip of paper to the bailiff. The silence was absolute as the bailiff passed the paper to the judge, who read it without a flicker of expression. The judge handed it back to the foreperson. In the matter of the state of Texas versus Raymond Dunning, on the count of aggravated assault on a minor, how do you find? The woman took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the judge. Guilty. A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Maya squeezed her father's hand, a small, convulsive movement. Claire closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. A single, deep exhalation. Dunning seemed to shrink in his chair. the word hitting him with a physical force that made him slump as if his spine had been removed. On the count of abuse of authority, the judge continued, his voice a steady monotone. How do you find? Guilty, the foreperson repeated, her voice stronger this time. And on the count of attempted evasion of justice, how do you find? Guilty, it was done. Mark Dunning was led out in cuffs, his face a blank mask of disbelief. He didn't look at the seagulls. He didn't look at anyone. His career was over. His freedom was gone. His name was now a permanent synonym for failure and disgrace. Outside the courthouse, a wall of cameras and reporters surged forward as the family emerged. The crowd that had gathered erupted into applause. A dozen questions were shouted at once. Michael Seagal held up a hand, and a respectful quiet fell over the press corps. This was not a moment of celebration. His expression was still made of iron. This was a victory for my daughter, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. But one guilty verdict for one man is not justice. It's a start. The work isn't over. He looked directly into the cameras, speaking to the entire country. So now, we build something. We build something that doesn't need a seagull to be heard. We build something for every voice that has been silenced. Later that evening, the public victory felt distant, in a quiet, sterile hallway of the hospital, away from the cameras. Michael leaned against the wall, the exhaustion of the past weeks finally settling onto his shoulders. They said guilty, he said, his voice low, as if testing the reality of the word. They did, Claire replied, her arms crossed as she stood watching Maya through a window, now resting peacefully in her room. For him, for today. But it doesn't fix her arm, Michael said, the pain in his voice raw and unfiltered. It doesn't erase that look in her eyes when she thinks no one's watching her. It's still there. Claire nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving her niece. No, it doesn't, she agreed. That's why this can't be the end. Dunning isn't the disease. Michael, he's just a symptom, a loud one. We have to go after the disease now. That conversation was the premise. The action was an immediate and massive expansion. They didn't just celebrate the verdict. They mobilized. The FIST initiative was formally launched nationwide. This was no longer just a website. It was a physical, brick-and-mortar operation. Leases were signed on small, functional office spaces in 20 different states. From Florida to Washington, Claire and Michael didn't hire consultants. They hired a full-time army. Retired detectives who knew how to work cold cases, hungry young civil rights attorneys looking for a fight, and digital forensic analysts who could pull truth from corrupted hard drives all joined the cause. The motto was simple. We don't wait for permission. We shine the light. The result was a testament to a nationwide hunger for accountability. The database of abuse cases, which had started with the stories from the town hall, exploded. The number of verified submissions soared past 31,000. It was a horrifying, heartbreaking, and powerful library of pain, each entry a potential lawsuit, a potential headline, a potential crack in another blue wall of silence somewhere in America. One evening, weeks later, Claire sat in their new Pasadena headquarters, a map on a large screen in front of her dotted with the locations of their new offices. For a moment, she allowed herself a flicker of accomplishment. They had built the machine. Her secure phone on the desk beside her buzzed once. It was an encrypted message from her contact, Sarah Soto. Subject, incoming retaliation. Eyes on you. Claire's focus sharpened as she read the rest. FIST operations flagged for investigation in 5 cities. Cease and desist order being prepared in 1. Legal challenges to block personnel file access in 2 others. They're scared. Be careful. Claire read the encrypted message twice, the faint glow of her phone screen illuminating the hard lines of her face. The warning wasn't a surprise, it was an inevitability. The system she was fighting wouldn't simply surrender. She didn't panic. She acted. With precise movements, she forwarded the message to 2 key contacts. The first went to the head of her digital forensics team with a simple 2-word directive. harden everything. The second went to their lead counsel with a note. Anticipate legal challenges in these jurisdictions. Prepare counter-filings. Then she made a call to Michael. "They're coming," she said, her voice a flat statement of fact. "Official channels. They're done with back alley tactics." The premise was clear. The enemy was no longer just hiding, it was organizing. A new, more sophisticated war was about to begin. The attack came less than 12 hours later, a two-pronged assault of digital force and reputational poison. The Fist Initiative's servers, which had been hardened just in time, were hit with a massive distributed denial-of-service attack, a brute force attempt to shut them down. Alarms blared in their new headquarters as the tech team worked furiously, fending off intrusion attempts from international servers designed to mask the true origin. They managed to protect the core database of testimonies, but the public-facing website, SeagalJustice.org, flickered and went dark. Simultaneously, the smear campaign began. Fabricated articles appeared on fringe blogs, accusing the Seagal family of using their foundation as a tax shelter. But the more insidious attack was the leak of edited text messages, cleverly twisted to make Claire sound unstable and violent. "I'm going to break him," one text read, stripped of the context that she was referring to an officer's career, not his body. A prominent pro-police influencer with millions of followers posted them with a sanctimonious headline, "Exclusive, leaked texts reveal vigilante rage of Michael Seagal's niece." It was a coordinated effort to paint her not as a protector, but as a dangerous aggressor. But the system's next move went beyond servers and headlines. It was a move of pure, cold-blooded intimidation, aimed at the one person they knew was the family's only vulnerability. The premise was the failure of their first attacks. The action was to escalate to the unthinkable. Claire received it as she was coordinating with her legal team, a short, silent video file from an unknown, untraceable email address. There was no message, just the attachment. She opened it. The footage was shaky, clearly taken from a high-altitude drone. It panned slowly over a sun-drenched playground, the familiar grounds of the private, protected school where Maya had been relocated. Children were playing, their laughter a faint, distant sound. The drone's camera then zoomed, its focus tightening on a single figure standing near the fence line, partially obscured by a large oak tree. It was a man, hands in his pockets, just watching. His face was a digital blur, but his posture, his stillness, radiated pure menace. He was a predator observing his prey. The clip lasted only 10 seconds, then cut to black. The air left Claire's lungs. The professional calm she had maintained throughout arrests and legal threats finally fractured. This was not a lawsuit. This was not a smear campaign. This was a threat against a child. Her hands trembled as she called Michael. For the first time, her voice was not the steady, controlled tone of a soldier, but the raw, choked voice of a terrified aunt. "They're not going after us anymore." "Michael," she whispered into the phone. "They're going after her." The apathetic system had finally found its true weapon, fear. But they had miscalculated. They believed that threatening a child would make the Seagals retreat. Instead, it was the premise for a final, scorched earth response. They were done being strategic. They were done playing chess. This was the moment they decided to burn the board. 2 days later, they held an emergency press conference, not at their headquarters, not at a hotel, but on the granite steps of the federal courthouse in downtown Houston. The location was a deliberate symbol. They were appealing to the highest form of justice in the land. A massive crowd of reporters, supporters, and protesters had gathered, their numbers dwarfing any previous event. Helicopters hovered overhead, their rotor wash whipping the flags on the courthouse pillars. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Claire stepped to the bank of microphones first. She looked out at the sea of faces, her own face pale but set with an iron resolve. She held up a single black flash drive for all to see. "We were warned to stop," she began, her voice clear and strong. amplified by the speakers to carry across the plaza. We were threatened. Our digital infrastructure was attacked, and my name was smeared. Yesterday, they went after our daughter again. A murmur went through the crowd. They believe fear is a weapon that can make us sit down and be silent. They are wrong. She held the flash drive higher. So now, we're pulling back the curtain. On this drive are 49 leaked internal memos from 3 separate police departments, 12 sealed personnel files of officers with repeated violent offenses, and over 31,000 verified testimonies of abuse that were systematically buried. We are releasing it all. Today. Now. Gasps rippled through the press corps. This was no longer just a fight, it was an act of total information warfare. Before they could fully process the bombshell, a large screen behind Claire flickered to life. The drone footage played, the playground, the children, the menacing figure at the fence line. The image froze, then zoomed, the pixels rearranging. Our digital team ran an AI facial recognition enhancement on the man they sent to intimidate a 10-year-old girl, Claire announced, her voice ringing with cold fury. The blurred face sharpened into a clear, identifiable photograph. His name is Richard Adler, a retired high-ranking sergeant from a neighboring county, forced into early retirement after a series of misconduct complaints against him were sealed. This is the system protecting its own. The crowd erupted. The revelation was undeniable, a clear conspiracy to intimidate a federal witness. That action, broadcast live across the world, was a premise the Department of Justice could not ignore. Within the hour their national office would announce a full federal investigation into coordinated suppression and intimidation efforts across 3 states. But the moment wasn't over. As the chaos swirled, Michael Seagal stepped forward and gently guided his daughter to the microphone. The entire massive crowd fell silent. Maya, now 10 years old, looked out, not with fear, but with a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her small frame. She held the microphone in both hands. "My name is Maya Seagal," she said, her voice clear and steady. "A man broke my arm and tried to make me feel like I didn't belong." She paused, taking a breath, her eyes finding her aunt in the crowd. "But I do, and so does every kid who never gets listened to." She then lifted up another drawing, her own. It was not of a lion, but of a small girl holding a giant megaphone, sound waves blasting out of it, and beneath it, written in the same neat, careful letters as before, were 3 new words: "Her voice matters." A wave of thunderous applause washed over the plaza. In that moment, the crowd didn't just see a victim. They saw the spark of a new era, one born in the aftermath of a quiet Sunday afternoon, one that had risen through pain and truth. They saw a symbol of resilience, carried on the clear, unbroken voice of a child who had dared to speak, and in doing so, had taught the world to listen.